What if I told you that getting rich has almost nothing to do with how smart you are? Seriously. That's the huge idea in Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. He argues that financial success isn't really about what you know, it's all about how you behave. It's way more psychology than it is science. So let's ask the big question. What's the real secret to wealth? We're always told it's about being brilliant, having a fancy degree, or knowing all the right people. But what if the answer is something totally different? Something, well, a lot more human? All right, to kick things off, Housel tells this incredible story that just perfectly sums up the whole idea. It's the tale of a janitor and a high-flying executive. So, on one hand, you've got Ronald Reed, a really humble guy, no college degree, spent his days fixing cars and sweeping floors, just lived a super quiet life. And on the other hand, Richard Fuscone, Harvard MBA, big shot career in finance, lived this incredibly lavish lifestyle. You think you know how this story ends, right? Well, get this. When Ronald Reed, the janitor, passed away, he left behind a fortune of $8 million. All he did was save his small earnings, invest them patiently, and just let time do its thing. And Richard Fuscone, the Harvard exec, he went completely bankrupt. So what on earth happened? It clearly wasn't about brains or education. This story just slams the point home. Finance isn't a hard science like physics. It's a soft skill. And how you behave, your patience, your discipline, that's so much more important than the complex stuff you can crunch in a spreadsheet. And that idea leads us straight to our financial superpower, our behavior. But here's where Housel has a really fascinating take on it. He says that when it comes to money, nobody is actually crazy. There's this quote in the book that just nails it. It says, our own personal experiences with money are this tiny, tiny fraction of everything that's ever happened, but they make up something like 80% of how we think the world actually works. Our own little slice of reality feels like the only reality. Think about it like this. If you were born in, say, 1970, you saw stocks go to the moon during your teens and 20s. But if you were born in 1950, you saw them go basically nowhere for years. Both of you form perfectly rational ideas about investing, but they're completely different. Neither of you is crazy. You just grew up in different financial worlds. But hey, it's not all just about what's going on inside our own heads. We've got to talk about the huge unseen forces that are always at play. Things like luck, risk, and this really powerful idea called long tails. Let's take Bill Gates. His success involved a massive dose of luck. He just happened to go to one of the only high schools on the planet that had a computer back in 1968. That's a 1 in a million head start. But luck has a dark twin, risk. Gates' best friend, Kent Evans, who was just as brilliant, died in a mountaineering accident before they even graduated. A 1 in a million tragedy. Same force, just pointing in opposite directions. And all this leads to a pretty wild concept called long tails. Basically, it means that in things like investing, you can have a handful of massive, out-of-the-park home runs that are so successful, they completely erase a long list of strikeouts. It's why Housel says you can literally be wrong half the time and still end up incredibly wealthy. And the data completely backs this up. If you look at individual stocks, a huge percentage of them are just duds. More than half of all tech stocks end in a catastrophic loss. About 40% of all public companies in the index basically fail. It's kind of a graveyard out there. So, if most stocks are losers, how in the world does the market go up? Because the winners, oh man, they win big. Even though 40% of its companies failed, the index as a whole returned a mind-blowing 73 times your money. All the gains are driven by a tiny, tiny fraction of huge winners. That is the long tail in action. Okay, so we get the theory, but how do we actually apply this stuff? Well, that brings us to the art of survival, a skill that Housel says is way more important than just getting rich in the first place. See, getting wealthy and staying wealthy are two completely different things. They're not even related. Getting rich usually means you have to be optimistic and take some big risks. But staying rich, that requires the total opposite. It requires humility and even a little bit of paranoia, that fear that everything you've built could be taken away in a flash. And the undisputed champion of staying wealthy is, of course, Warren Buffett. Now listen to this, because it's an absolutely insane fact. Of his roughly $84.5 billion net worth, $81.5 billion of it came after he turned 65. That right there, that points to his real secret. His skill is obviously investing, but his real secret weapon is time. His wealth didn't grow in a straight line. It exploded like a rocket ship later in life. That's the mind-bending power of compounding. Yeah, he's a great investor, but the magic is that he's been a great investor who has stayed in the game for over 75 years. That's survival, that longevity, that's everything. So, we're figuring out how to get wealthy, how to stay wealthy, but let's just take a breath. What's the actual point of all this? Why even bother? And that brings us to the final and honestly the most important lesson of all. The ultimate reward that money gives you isn't a fancy car or a huge house. It's freedom. And this isn't just a nice thought. Housel brings up the work of a psychologist, Angus Campbell. And he found that having a strong sense of control over your own life is a better predictor of happiness than anything else. Better than your salary, the size of your house, anything. Just control. So that brings us to the real definition of wealth. True wealth isn't about buying more stuff. It's the ability to wake up every single morning and say to yourself, I can do whatever I want today. True wealth is control over your time. And you know what? That's a goal worth fighting for.